to cue our webinar producer to move us to our main presentation room and introduce Anthony Petrosino, facilitator of the Urban School Improvement Alliance, and his co-moderators, Kayleen Cook and Jessica Bailey. So, good afternoon, Anthony. I'm going to hand it over to you and wish you all a great webinar this afternoon.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate that. I'm really delighted on behalf of the Regional Education Laboratory for the Northeast and Islands and for the Urban School Improvement Alliance. We want to welcome you all to today's bridge event entitled Disciplinary Data Use and Research Lessons from Syracuse. Today's agenda, as you can see, is pretty packed here. After a short introduction that I'll conclude very quickly, we have, I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Dan Lowson, and he will talk about understanding and using data to remedy the school-to-prison pipeline. My colleague with the REL, with the Regional Lab, Kayleen Cook, will then facilitate a question and answer period with Dan. We'll then move on to a panel discussion that will feature Andrew Seeger, who led a Regional Lab report on the use of data in decision-making in Syracuse around their student code of conduct. And Timothy Moon from the Syracuse City School District will provide some perspectives from the local policy and practice context. And then my colleague from the REL, Jessica Bailey, will also facilitate the question and answer period after the panel, and then we'll close out, and we'll also close out the webinar. Just to give you a little bit of background about our alliance that is hosting the webinar today, we have two goals basically around building capacity for the use and access of data, and then to examine school performance within a larger context. There are two publications, one available and one in progress, that you might be interested in that are very relevant to today's webinar. The first is the one that Andrew is going to be speaking about and that Tim will also be commenting on, and that's the report on the use of data and research to inform policy formation and implementation in Syracuse, and that is published and available. And the other report is actually in progress, and that is a report that we were actually very honored to work with Dan on, which is a applied research methods report providing guidance to districts on analyzing student-level disciplinary data, and we hope that will be published in the fall. So today's goals are to learn from real examples of how data can be used to inform school discipline policies, hopefully with the idea that these can be applied in your districts or your context, and similar strategies could be applied to be helpful in those contexts, and then to also explore some different ways to measure disparities relevant to efforts to identify and remedy racial disproportionality. So it gives me great pleasure, and I'm delighted to be able to have an opportunity on behalf of the REL and the Alliance to introduce today's keynote speaker. Dan Lowson is the director for the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at the University of California at Los Angeles. And Dan had cautioned me to be very brief in my introduction to him, so I'll just say that I consider Dan to be one of the foremost experts in the country on this topic, really a national treasure on everything related to disciplinary data, and so it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce and turn the rein over to Dan. Dan?
Thanks. Thanks, Anthony, and it's a great privilege to be able to present to all of you today. I'll be focused on understanding and using data to remedy the pipeline. My experience comes from looking at data across the country. There's just recently been released a new set of OCR data for 2013-14. I've worked with states and school districts to analyze their data in ways that are more useful to identify disproportionality, but also in both discipline and special education, but also with an eye towards what's working, as well as where are there problems. I've also worked with researchers across the country in the areas of graduation rates and special education, and more recently on school discipline, to look at what works to not only address the racial disparities, but to bring suspension rates down in a way that closes the racial gap, and hopefully in the future to look at disability gaps as well. And I have a background as a teacher. I taught in the public schools for about 10 years. So this is just the cover of the most recent report we issued from February of 2015, and there will be another one now that we have a new data set that will look at the progress since then. And according to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, they just released a brief summary that saying that suspension rates across the nation are down by about 20%. So in just a 2-year period, that's a tremendous decline. This next graph shows how, for a long period, suspension rates were increasing, but as you can see, this graph shows you that this is based on K through 12 numbers of students suspended at least once. So we're not counting suspensions here, we're counting actual unduplicated numbers of students. And it really demonstrates the racial impact that as school districts have adopted zero tolerance or no excuses kinds of policies, we see a dramatic increase, but especially for black students. So the racial gap grew tremendously, and I suspect, and based on our analysis in California and elsewhere, that the gap is now narrowing as suspension rates are starting to come back down. It's really important to look at the data disaggregated not only by the major and racial ethnic groups, but also breaking it down by looking at what's going on in elementary schools versus secondary schools, looking at disability, the confluence of race and disability, looking at the school level so that you're looking at within your district, looking at your elementary schools, but also K through 8. You may have some charter schools, and really looking at the school level differences. And if you have the data, and many districts do, looking at the disability type. So we know that, for example, students with emotional disturbance are suspended at nationally about 33% K through 12. That's just incredibly high percentage of students with emotional disturbance suspended at least once out of school. So here's the breakdown very briefly. You can see how in elementary schools versus secondary schools, for all these groups, the suspension rates, double or triple, and you can see that the differences, the racial disparities, also expand as suspensions are used more often. So there's a tremendous disconnect. There's a lot to maybe be learned from what's going on in elementary schools in terms of approach to behavior. Of course, kids are more likely to challenge authority, but there are some developmental aspects of what goes on in a secondary school, but in terms of what goes on in the brains of children that maybe isn't being adjusted to in ways that would help keep more kids in school. So, but it's also just goes to the point that if you're looking at K through 12 data, you might be missing some really large disparities, and the most frequent use of suspensions tends to be in the middle schools and the high schools. So here is a breakdown, just as an example, when you look at race with disability status with gender. So this is now looking at and this is at the secondary level. So we find, if you see the largest bar across there, tells you that black male students at the secondary level, that 34%, this is across all their disabilities, not emotional disturbance, so 34%. So more than 1 in 3 black male students with a disability at the secondary level were suspended out of school at least one time. If we were counting suspensions, these numbers would look even higher, and we'll talk about the importance of looking at both the unduplicated counts as well as the counts of suspensions. But we're still looking at only unduplicated counts. One of the things that's very encouraging is oftentimes these schools and districts that are suspending students at very high numbers, they may be doing things that in terms of changing their codes of conduct, or they may be pursuing policies that they can have, by changing those policies, they can have a dramatic impact in a short period of time. In Baltimore, for example, now they dramatically reduced suspensions by eliminating suspensions for truancy. So this graph shows you of the 20 large districts that had very high rates, that had the really large declines. Across those 20, the black suspension rates went from 52%. So that's just that's over half the black students enrolled. This is at the secondary level, but it's down to 21%. So in a very short period of time, that's a huge decline. And you see there was declines as well for Latinos and for white students. So whatever was going on in these districts, and we didn't do that piece of the analysis, but it did have a tremendous impact when changes were pursued. So the other thing to keep in mind is that within your districts, within your state, there are very likely schools or districts with similar demographics that have lower suspension rates. There's a lot to be learned from principals, superintendents, in the neighboring district or the neighboring school. And what we found is that, and these are somewhat, the cut points were based on looking at national averages, and we designated that if a school, or this is a school analysis, so if a school suspended 25% or more of any of these subgroups, kids with disabilities or major racial ethnic groups, that school is labeled high suspending. And if every one of those groups was 10% or lower, it was designated lower suspending. And at the secondary level, we found that there were 8,000 in the high suspending category, but more, 13,000 in the lower suspending category. And we performed a similar analysis at the elementary level, just changed the rubric. So the high was 10% or more, any group over that, and every group at 2% or below. And again, you see tremendous numbers of schools across the country with very low suspension rates. So this idea that, maybe they found something that worked, in academic research, this is just showing that answers are right there around the corner, that there are schools and districts that may never have even increased suspension rates. And so there are a lot of educators to learn from in terms of what works. We also do have research from scholars around the country about what works, and these include, leading scholars like David Osher, Ann Gregory, Tali Gonzalez, different kinds of analysis. So looking at restorative practices, looking at PBIS, social emotional learning, tiered systems of interventions, which is PBIS. We know from this research that suspension is related to a significantly higher risk for dropping out incarceration. In fact, we just published a new study, not in that book, called The High Cost of Harsh Discipline and Its Disparate Impact, where in two states and nationally, looking at longitudinal data, they showed that after controlling for other reasons that students dropped out, we looked at how much it was caused by suspensions, and then we did an economic analysis because we know what dropouts cost. And it was $35 billion of dropouts caused by suspensions nationally would be saved in terms of the lifetime cost. So that's a new study. Didn't make it into the slide because we just released it before these were approved, but I call your attention to that. But the high costs should, as districts are trying to grapple what to do and how to spend resources, there are really returns on these investments in terms of interventions. And schools can make a difference. Another study looked at school leadership and found that the attitudes of principals, more than other factors, so after controlling for race and poverty, what predicted whether suspension rates were high or low, and also predicted racial disparities. So principals who had sort of bought into the zero tolerance mentality or blame parents and teachers for the problems of misbehavior tended to have much higher suspension rates and lower achievement scores, and also higher racial disparities than those that saw addressing behavior as part of the educational mission of the school. It wasn't that they were laissez-faire or allowed chaos to reign. There were interventions, there were rules, but the whole concept was to keep kids in school and to teach appropriate behavior. Other studies have shown intensive training in a randomized controlled study, the teachers who received training in improving their student-teacher engagement, and there wasn't a racial piece to this. Those teachers had dramatically reduced their office disciplinary referrals and also eliminated racial disparities. And then restorative practice and tiered interventions. There's a lot of research and a growing body of research to show that it really does work. Here's a multi-year study of restorative practices in Denver. And what you see here is how, as the Denver School District adopted restorative practices and expanded them, they started out with a sort of pilot program. There was a real reduction in suspension rates for all these different subgroups, So that's what you're looking at, the percentage of this is also unduplicated counts. And so you see the racial gap narrows over the course of time. What we also found is that in the same period, scores went up in every subject for every racial group, with one exception, and their on-time graduation rates also increased. So whether all those increases were due to reducing suspensions, this is just showing a correlation, but it also says the sky didn't fall in Denver when they dramatically reduced their suspension rates. So that's, it's sort of the alternative hypothesis that if you reduce suspensions, you're going to lose any kind of academic achievement benefits is, it's not supported in the evidence. So in general, in terms of how to measure disproportionality, it's really important to think about what kinds of data to use, what to look at, and one of the general overarching principles, I think, is that knowing what kinds of, the lost instruction, the increased risk of dropping out, the lower achievement that's associated, we want to reduce suspensions. So whatever measure we choose should reflect whether suspension rates are going up or down. It shouldn't be a purely relative measure that might be agnostic to whether rates are going up. So if you're just looking at relationships between blacks and whites or different groups and not paying attention to the magnitude of suspensions, that's probably not the right measure to choose, especially to measure progress over time. So you want something that will capture the magnitude of the change, but also the racial differences. And I find that you looking at the differences rather than as a ratio is a good way to capture both. No measure is perfect, though. So I'll go through some of the reasons and ways to look at suspension rates that might be really beneficial to marking progress and to identifying what's working in your own district. So it's really important that we acknowledge that there can't be progress if the group that's being suspended at the highest rate, if their suspension rates go up. And I would also argue it can't be progress if the group at the bottom is increasing. We want suspension rates to decrease for all the groups that we're comparing. So choosing a method that flags high suspension is really important. You can use thresholds. You can compare to state averages. Choosing a measure that reflects the magnitude. This is sort of just a review of what I just went over. And one that looks at real progress in terms of reducing racial differences. And I point out that looking at ratios is not as effective as looking at the actual gaps. So it's the absolute difference. It's the difference between using subtraction or division, and I'll explain that. So the bottom, the common calculation to all this is looking at what's called risk. It's just the percentage of students. You take the total. You have to know your enrollment numbers, and you have to know the total numbers of students who were suspended. And here we're using unduplicated counts, so students who were suspended one or more times. And it's a very simple thing. You take the number that were suspended and divide it by their enrollment. It's I call it fifth grade math. I taught fifth grade for a long time. So in this example, 5 divided by, if there were 200 enrolled, 5 black students were suspended. That means 2.5% of the enrolled students were suspended at least one time. And so the difference is you do the same calculations for each group. So let's say we came out with 10% of black students enrolled were suspended and 5% of whites. The difference would be 5 percentage points. So it's not a 5% difference, it's a percentage point difference. Oftentimes, folks get confused about that. So you really, when you're talking about the absolute difference, we're talking about percentage points. And because when you're talking about percents, it's usually a change from an existing value. And it depends on what that existing value is. So here's an example looking at racial differences using subtraction or looking at ratios. So remember, if you're doing ratios, you do the same risk analysis, but you divide. So in this city A, in year 2000, if 80% of the black students were suspended and 40% of the white students, 80 divided by 40 is 2. So it's twice as likely that the black students were suspended compared to the white students. There's also a 40 percentage point difference. So the racial difference is 40 points. The racial disparity in ratio terms is twice as likely. Same thing in 2005 for City A, but now the racial gap has narrowed considerably, but it still registers 50 divided by 25. It's twice as likely. Now, fast forward to 2010. Now the racial gap has shrunk from 40 to 25 to just 8 percentage point difference, yet the ratio went up. It went from twice as likely to 5 times as likely. And then imagine districts invested heavily in finding alternatives to suspension. It's almost eliminated, but we're left with 2% of the black students enrolled and 1/10 of 1%. Now the racial differences is less than 2 points. That would be a desirable outcome given the negative impact from suspending students. But the ratio is now 20 times as likely that black students were suspended compared to whites. And this same problems, if you comparison it was blacks to all non-blacks, the same issues arise. So another thing to think about, oftentimes we're operating with too little information. And this is important whether you're speaking to the public or analyzing your data internally. So if someone said 3 out of every 4 suspended children were black, what do we know? Is this excessive? Is there disproportionality? We're actually missing some information. What if only 4 children in all, total, were suspended? So that would be 3 black students and 1 white student. Do we yet know if that's disproportionate or excessive? I would argue not yet, because what if blacks were 75% of the enrollment? Then it would be proportionate. You would expect 3 out of 4 black students to be suspended. Could it be excessive but proportionate? Absolutely. So let's think put some real numbers, the missing numbers, in and see how this comes out. The enrollment was half black and half white, and there were 1,000 black students, 1,000 white students enrolled. And total, and 3 out of 4 black students. Well, it would sound disproportionate, yet suspension risk would.
It appears we're having some technical difficulty.
I'm not on mute.
Hi, Jenny. Can you hear me? It's Jessica.
Do you want to change headsets?
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Again. Yes, we can hear you
Oh.
again. Go ahead and pick up.
I don't think I hit anything.
That's all right.
Okay.
Go ahead and pick up where you were.
I apologize. So, in the last example, the difference was very, very small. The ratio was high. Now, if you change the parameters, and we're looking at 1,000 students suspended, and the ratio is the same, that means there's 750 out of 1,000, 75% of the blacks. And there are districts and schools that have suspension rates as high. And what if it were 250 out of 1,000 for the white students? That would be a huge racial gap of 50 percentage points. A racial difference that was 250 times larger than the 2/10 of a percentage point that we discussed in the first example. So it's basically still the same ratio, but a much different picture. So it's really important that we all sort of acknowledge ratios cannot indicate whether suspensions are excessive or the disparities are large or small in terms of the absolute differences that we should really be concerned about. So comparing the proportion of suspensions to the proportion of enrollment has similar kinds of issues. So I really encourage folks that if people have their preferences, but always look at the underlying suspension rates and look at the racial differences in addition to whatever else you may be doing. So this is very relevant because many of you may be concerned with the proposed rule around racial disparities in special education, where the federal government has recommended looking at ratios and progress over time using ratios. And I think the comment period has ended, but I would certainly support, as states do create whatever the new rules say, to encourage the federal government to use racial differences as well as ratios. And there are ways you can do both. And here's just another point, a way to illustrate the reason that there was a proposed rule or a change was because there was only, I think, 28 states that identified any districts as being racially disproportionate among students with disabilities. So, and racial disproportionality in the special ed world includes identification, restrictiveness of educational setting, but also disparities in discipline. In fact, the plurality of districts that were identified in, I think, 13-14 were regarding racial disparities among kids with disabilities in discipline. And in Texas, for example, there were 110. Now we're switching the rubric, so we're talking about suspensions, all disciplinary removals, suspensions, in and out of school suspensions, switches to alternative schools and expulsions. So we're counting those all together. So the numbers are going to be a little bit higher. But for every 100 black students enrolled, this is K through 12 in Texas, with disabilities, 110 had a disciplinary removal. 110 for every 100, and it was 40 for every 100 white students. Now, how many of you would guess, how many districts do you think this is statewide, so how many districts do you think were identified in Texas? You can all guess in your own heads. There were none, 0. This is, so this is one of the reasons that the proposed rule will change. I'm not sure exactly the parameters of that change, but the expectation will be that states will be reviewing districts, and more districts will have to be looking at racial disproportionality in discipline, among other categories, among kids with disabilities. And so one of the questions comes up, well, if we're identified, if it's my district, what do? There's a requirement that 15% of your Part B funds be used for coordinated early intervening services. And how can that help, address these disparities in discipline? So they've broadened what those funds can be used for, but also who. So no longer are they saying, or at least the proposed rule says, it could be used for kids with disabilities as well as those without, which makes sense because if it's the disparate suspension of black students with disabilities, you would expect, or you would hope, that they could be beneficiaries of coordinated early intervening services and training for teachers and so forth. So exactly how that plays out is yet to be determined, but this is something that's coming down, and it also goes to how you look at your discipline data, or how the state looks at the discipline data. The interventions can look at things like do trainings around implicit bias, could be around behavioral needs. There's sort of a whole range, and it could also look at what's going on in preschool. But it can be, the point is that it can be used, and it's supposed to be used if the proposed rules are finalized, to address these racial disparities, and particularly the kids who are the triggering group for its transfer. Now, there's also a problem. Some people say, well, what if there's a school or a district that's predominantly black students? So one of the ways, one of the concerns is oftentimes those schools and districts have very, very high suspension rates for black students. So is it disproportionate? So it also raises a question, well, compared to what? Are you always just restricted to looking at comparisons within the district? Or can you compare to a state average or a national average? So there's a disturbing tendency that racially isolated schools are often overlooked because someone will say, well, there's either no comparison group or and so rather than focusing just on within district comparisons, there's other ways to do the comparisons. And this will come up more if you're comparing your enrollment, your percent of the students enrolled to the percent of the students who were suspended. If you do the analysis that way, it's less likely than a racially isolated district you'd ever see any disproportionality. But if you look at the risk numbers and you can compare those, any district or to the state or national average, then it's much more likely you'll see some very large differences. So what other, if at the district level, what else should you be looking at? So this, some of this these insights came out of work with Syracuse and other districts. It's really important to look at expulsions, arrests, referrals to law enforcement, because if those are going up while your suspension rates are going down, it doesn't really suggest that you've made a lot of progress. In fact, there are concerns that you'll be creating unsafe environments if you just tell teachers they can't suspend kids. Well, that's really, no one's really arguing that that's a solution. No one's saying chaos is acceptable. Safety is really not on the table. There should be no trade-offs with safety. So you really want to find interventions that work, and the research suggests that, in fact, they do help improve the sense of safety and reduce serious offenses by addressing behavior in ways that's more constructive and less punitive. Throughout the state of California, where there's been a dramatic reduction in suspension rates for defiance and disruption, there was also similar reduction in suspensions for the most serious offenses. So another thing, we talked about counts of suspensions per 100, but looking at the type of offense is really important to that analysis, and also to really put clear data on the question of whether safety is being, traded, whether there has been a trade-off. So some folks may get pushback when you start to do these interventions, but if you look at the data by type of offense, you can say, no, in fact, suspensions for offenses of every type have gone down. Or if they're not, that's important information. Maybe the kind of intervention you're invested in is not really being successful if folks don't feel safer. Looking at school level data, and I'd also look at, internally at least, looking at teacher level data. We've heard, at least anecdotally, that in some schools and districts, it's a very small percentage of the teachers that are responsible for a very large percentage of the suspensions. And now I have to say, I taught for 10 years. I was that guy. I was that teacher who was sending kids to the principal's office right and left, but I got support and training. I had a very wise principal, and she said, Dan, you have a classroom management problem, and because I really was dedicated to teaching, I didn't take it defensively. I got trained, and I reflected on my practice. There were a lot of things in the training that helped me right away. The next slide here is from Syracuse, and we're looking now at, and this sort of goes to the importance of really breaking down the data, not just by race, but race with disabilities. And in Syracuse, we see that this is, again, now we're not counting unduplicated, but we're counting suspensions. You can see across the different racial groups that students, for each racial group, the students with disabilities were suspended at much higher rates. So this really suggests that the kinds of supports and services that are providing around behavior for kids with disabilities may be lacking and have to be strengthened. Remember, this is data from 2012-13, and there's been a tremendous decrease in suspensions, although I haven't seen the final data set, but we'll hear about that with the next presenter. So the progress has been made, but part of progress, you can't know if what you're doing is working or not if you don't really take a close look and disaggregate your data in ways that really reveal some of the most profound disparities. And you can see here, similar to like Texas, there are 100, these are suspensions though, 104.9 suspensions for every 100 black students with disabilities. Why I discuss why look at the type of offense. It strengthens the argument when you are doing things right that there are alternative responses and that suspensions are ways to reduce the use that don't mean, that kids are doing more violent or dangerous things. Let's see. It's also what we tend to see is in this next slide is that it really is the most minor and subjective offense categories that we see the largest disparities. Again, these are counts of suspensions, and this is, again, data from Syracuse that's somewhat out of date. But we see for the minor offenses, there was a gap of 27 suspensions per 100 between the white students and the black students. And for the most serious ones involving guns, drugs, violence with injury, first of all, they were very low relative to the other offenses, and the racial gap was much, much smaller. And here is when we looked at Syracuse and we added disabilities. So the gap got even larger. Among the kids with disabilities, the racial gap was 36 suspensions per 100 in the minor offense category, and about 2 suspensions per 100 in the most serious category. Other thing to look at in Massachusetts has just has this report on days of lost instruction that just went online, and you can look at it disaggregated by race. But in Syracuse, we looked at this, and this really drives home the academic link. Kids who are being suspended are losing really important days of instruction. Another study on chronic absenteeism showed that students who had lost 3 days, were absent 3 days before taking the National Assessment of Education Progress in Reading at the 4th grade level, lost a full grade level after controlling for all these other factors. So losing instructional time is really detrimental, and especially if they're for minor offenses for which other interventions that don't remove kids from school could be used, then we could expect some academic benefits from reducing suspensions. So there was a slight decline in Syracuse, but it's really important to look at this data, and this is kind of information you can look at the building level. We talked about looking at arrests and referral to law enforcement expulsions. This is especially important as investment decisions, or whether you're investing in counselors or school resource officers and getting the right balance. Here, when talking to the public, since these numbers are very, very low in most districts, it's important to change the scale to look at per thousand so that folks don't think this is something that's not important just because the numbers are low, because the impact on a child of being arrested or taken away in handcuffs is just tremendous. The impact is much greater than just being suspended out of school once or twice. The other thing is that in these kind of low incidence areas, another reason not to look at ratios but look at racial differences, is that often the comparison group is zero. Many schools, most schools, probably have 0 school-based arrests. And these are the ones that are collecting the data accurately, or 0 referrals to law enforcement, especially at the elementary level. But if they're happening, and you are trying to do a racial comparison, or be able to compute the ratio, because most of your comparisons will be 0. Individual schools really matter. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes left. Okay. So as I pointed out earlier, there are lots of schools and districts. When I work with large districts, I say it's really important to look at your school level data because you probably have leaders in your community who are doing things really well, and they could be part of your training. And also the credibility when it's someone who's part of the district, who knows the district culture, knows the issues that are being faced, and is still really being successful in this area. They're going to have a lot of credibility and hopefully a lot of persuasive power if there's any kind of resistance and reluctance. So research on, what works. I mentioned the attitude of the principals is of whether or not suspensions are high or low, but also whether there are racial disparities. One thing we looked at in Syracuse that suggested grade configurations might matter. This is not a rigorous research study, but it was just observations that I made. But it did suggest that in K through 8, suspension rates were lower for every racial group. When we looked at the kids who were in grades 6 through 8 in the K through 8 schools and compared them to kids in 6 through 8 in the middle schools that didn't have elementary schools. But so that's just something to think about. There are other benefits. So it's really important to look at your data at least annually, and I would say at the district level, internally to look at it, hopefully some things you would look at monthly. I wouldn't look at expulsions monthly because the numbers are so low. But days of lost instruction, the unduplicated counts of students who are suspended, broken down by race, these things are really important to look at it more frequently. Counts of suspension by offense category could be really important. Any time that you're trying out an intervention to get a before and after picture and using a consistent metric would be really important to do so that you can document what's working, or if it's not working, you can analyze more effectively. And then looking at your discipline data next to your achievement data, next to your graduation rate data, so that it's really important to think about discipline as part of the school climate, part of the educational environment, and not strictly as a safety issue. Obviously, the most serious offenses do invoke problems of safety, but most discipline is not about addressing a safety problem. It's about classroom management, looking at behavior, school climate, and creating the optimal conditions for learning. So it's also important to look at racial and ethnic data, as we discussed, looking at the disaggregated suspension rates at the school or district level. We discussed if you have data by poverty. Oftentimes people say, well, it's just poverty, and they don't want to think about the racial dynamics. So if you have the free and reduced lunch data, I would suggest you, and we did this in Syracuse, and we did find that there were disparities among the kids who were poor, and there were racial disparities among the kids who were not poor. And that sometimes it mitigates those differences, but it helps dispel the idea that this is just poverty, because schools really can't do much about poverty. But if there's elements of discrimination, unintentional bias that are influencing these rates, those are things. That's about the adults in the building. Those are things that we can look at. So it's important, I think, to dispel the idea that it's all about one thing. So there's a web tool that folks can go to see your district data and different ways to break it down, and some of the new reports that I mentioned. And so now we're in a question and answer period. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. This is Kayleen Cook from the USIA Alliance. And so that was a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation, and we now have an opportunity for a brief question and answer period. It will probably be about 5 minutes, but we will have a 15-minute question and answer at the end, so if you don't have an opportunity to ask your question now, you'll have an opportunity later. So please feel free to enter your questions directly into the chat on the bottom left, and we put a few into the holding pen for you, Dan. One of the questions we got from Holly was, how would you describe a racially isolated school?
That's a great question. So there's different, if you're studying patterns of diversity or segregation, there are different sort of parameters. Some consider like hyper racially isolated if it's 90% or more one racial group. Sometimes it's important to look at Black and Latino kids together compared to white kids. So there's not like a set way, but technically, if you're looking at a racial group and you're using the sort of more standard way of comparing your enrollment proportion to your proportion of suspensions, if you're 84%, let's say, Black students, well, they can never, and you're using so this rule of thumb of a 20% variation from the expected value. So if you're 84% of the population, you would be expected to be 84% of all the kids suspended. So a 10% variation would be 8.4 points. 20% would be 16.8. So if you add 16.8 to 84%, it's over 100%. In other words, it would be impossible to be considered disproportionate using that standard way. But if you're looking at the risk for suspensions and looking and subtracting, there could be 1,000 white students in Hartford, Connecticut, for example, is good one where it's about 94% Black and Latino students, but there are well over 1,000 white students. That's statistically plenty to compare to. Yet you will never be able to do detect racial disproportionality using sort of what's called the composition index, but you can using a risk difference.
Okay, gotcha. We got another question from Lisa and Eleanor. They asked, if schools count the number of suspensions without looking at students with suspensions, do they get an accurate picture? And they said, so what if there is a group of students with 20 each and the school only has 100 total, then they aren't getting to the root cause?
So if I understand I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think it's important to look at both the counts of suspensions and the unduplicated numbers of students, looking at both disaggregated by race, because you could have a situation where if you just look at unduplicated counts, maybe there's one or two kids who are, causing most of the suspensions, and you would miss that. But also there's also sometimes I hear pushback from teachers and administrators, well, it's just a few bad apples. So if looking at unduplicated counts sort of counters that sort of idea that it's just a few kids getting suspended over and over. You're counting unduplicated counts. No, it can't possibly be. On the other hand, very draconian systems may be suspending kids right and left for every little thing, but it could be a much larger disparity. Maybe that's how Black kids are experiencing, but not white students. And so that will magnify that. And especially if you look, once you're starting counting suspensions, usually that's organized by type of offense. So you can see, are these kids all bringing guns to school and drugs? Or are these mostly minor offenses that involve a lot of subjective determinations of whether or not, this behavior is serious enough to address that way?
Thanks. And another question we got from Kanali, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, is how are we defining disabilities in this presentation?
Okay, so using the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has 13 categories of disability, and so those are the ones that are tracked. So that what that does not include are students who are considered students with disabilities under Section 504. So those are often milder disabilities, ADHD, some kids, very mild behavioral issues or anxiety. And so the distinction in the law is whether a student's disability is interfering with their ability to learn, and therefore they need special education and related services. So some students need the special education component and have a disability, and those are the ones that are categorized in one of these 13 categories. So specific learning disabilities really catch all, like dyslexia, dyscalculia. There's emotional disturbance, intellectual disability used to be called mental retardation, speech and language impairments. Those are some of the major categories. Autism spectrum is another. So those are the major ones that that we're talking about.
Thanks, Dan. So we're going to move on to the next section of today's presentation now. We tracked a few questions from Holly, Mateen, and someone else, a guest, and we will definitely keep those for the question and answer later on. I'll turn it over to Anthony now.
Well, thank you so much, Kayleen, and really appreciated that question and answer period, although a little bit, we wish we had more time. There's a lot of great questions, and thanks, Dan, again, for a terrific presentation. And at this time, we're going to have our panel discussion, and we're delighted to welcome Andrew Seeger and Timothy Moon. Andrew was the founding facilitator of this alliance, the Urban School Improvement Alliance, so I guess in some sense he was my boss for about 3 years on this project. And a lot of the wonderful work that the Alliance has done over these years is due in large part to Andrew's leadership. And Andrew is the lead author of the report that he's going to be talking about on districts' use of data research to inform policy formation and implementation. We also are delighted to have Timothy Moon with us. Timothy is the Chief Accountability Officer for the Syracuse City School District. And he's been an educator for 23 years, including as a classroom teacher, assistant superintendent, and chief information officer, working in both the Ithaca and Auburn, New York school districts. So we're really delighted to have both Andrew and Timothy with us today in this panel. Before I turn it over to Andrew, we do have a poll for you, and it's coming up, and the questions that we have for you there, have you been involved at a school or district level in efforts to limit student suspension, yes or no? And then on the other question there is, have you been involved at a state level in developing policy or advising districts on methods for diminishing student suspension rates? And I'll give it just a second or two as we see the votes tally in here. Okay, well, it looks like under the local efforts, it's almost half, and on the state effort, it looks like about 60% saying no, 40% saying yes. Still, quite a number of people have been involved in these efforts, and so it's hopefully this webinar today is really helpful to you. So we can go back to the presentation. Thank you so much, Jenny, and we will now turn over to my good friend Andrew.
Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be working with you again today. As we looked at that poll result, I hope all of you who responded positively to these questions will add to this discussion through the chat function. What, for example, is the support the districts need from the state as the states develop criteria under the new legislation. So I want to move on then to this description of the Syracuse City School District case study. This proportion of the presentation moves from data on discipline and suspension to the approach Syracuse used to change from a zero tolerance to a restorative policy. A study was carried out by RELNI in response to a research question raised by members of its Urban School Improvement Alliance. The question, how do school boards and districts better use research and data to inform policy decisions? In some ways, the topic of discipline was incidental to our study, but it fits very well with this particular session. And we further appreciate that Syracuse was brave and gracious enough to allow us to study them. This slide indicates what we'll cover in this portion of the presentation. The first 6 items are elements of the change effort, all of which appear essential from change literature. The last addresses the current status and efforts in what is an ongoing process. in the slides that follow, I use quotes from people we interviewed as part of our study to highlight what was communicated to us. So the first is culture change. We know that data alone is inadequate to support change. You have to change cultural assumptions. Lord Roth and Lepper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, for example, write, and I quote, "People who hold strong opinions on complex social issues are likely to examine relevant empirical evidence in a biased manner. They're apt to accept confirming evidence at face value while subjecting disconfirming evidence to critical evaluation. As a result, draw undue support for their initial positions from mixed or random empirical findings. Thus, the result of exposing contended factions in a social dispute to an identical body of relevant empirical evidence may not be a narrowing of a disagreement, but rather increase polarization. You have to attend, in short, to culture. In Syracuse, the culture change began with a school board, where, as you can see from this quote, a well-written, usable strategic plan helped change board conversations to a focus on student outcomes. The superintendent simultaneously built district analytic capacity. And finally, discipline and student suspension wasn't a new topic to the district. It had been ducked for years, but this superintendent was willing to bring it to the fore, and district staff stuck with the issue. This is about initial data use, and Syracuse found that its discipline data had been inconsistent and often, in initial analysis, useless. As they went through their data, district staff had, for example, to go back to teachers, review their documentation with them, and ask why they coded behaviors in certain ways. Often the codes teachers had assigned didn't match with state's definitions. An issue throughout was that members of the public often compared Syracuse, a city school district, with nearby suburban districts with completely different demographics. District staff found this unfair, so the district took pains to compare itself to other urban settings. I want to mention the importance of empirical data that comes from patterns of experience, patterns systematically derived from anecdotal data and focus interviews. These were used to arrive at the policy questions that framed this change effort. Qualitative data was also used to arrive at a decision to move from zero tolerance to one rooted in restorative justice principles. Finally, the district spent significant time reviewing and understanding research on the effect of school suspension on graduation rates. I'm hearing that I'm not being heard very adequately. Just turn up the volume. Is that better? Policy formulation then followed from that. And I want to stress the importance here of an outside facilitator. Syracuse brought in a consultant with extensive experience in this field to shepherd the process. Then the district convened a large group, making sure there were representatives of all major interest groups. This is something the superintendent has used more than once for significant policy issues. This group in turn systematically examined and picked the best from other district codes of conduct. They eliminated terms that were being defined in wildly different ways and wrote behaviorally based terms. An example of this in our report is, and I quote, attack on student with serious bodily injury with or without provocation, in parens, hitting, kicking, or punching another student, end of parens. They felt that this was much more likely to result in clear data than the prior definitions like being disruptive. The district has since slightly revised the code based on feedback from its schools, and you'll hear more about that from Tim Moon. They also changed organizational structure. Teachers can now ask support staff, such as school counselors, for help addressing this behavior by a student. In addition, students are assigned support staff specifically to work with them on their behavior. Managing students is not just up to teachers. Every building now has a behavior intervention center, which is a one-stop shopping depot for all kids who get sent out of someplace. In addition, the district had contracted support for students to outside agencies. They found that these agencies were generally working with students who weren't being suspended. So they consequently changed the agency's MOUs to reserve spots for students who are being identified because of behavioral issues. The district also added new staff, including a chief ombuds officer, a director of school culture and climate, a new assistant trainer to the educator's handbook, and several analysts. Finally, each building is required to set its own targets to reduce the use of out-of-school suspension by a percentage of its own choosing for 2015 and by an additional percentage in 2016. And then finally we move to what schools and districts often move to first, professional development. With all of this in place, the district engaged in comprehensive professional development. The district trained nearly 3,000 people, all the way to bus drivers in its first round. And Syracuse continues to work with New York University's Technical Assistance Center on disproportionality. Finally, this is not just about consequences, but rights and responsibilities of all. So a major change is teaching students their rights and responsibilities and training them in those. Any information or change process like this requires ongoing feedback. The district tried to adapt existing software for the job, but found that it needed purpose-built software to really understand what was going on with its suspensions. The new software means that teachers can examine student discipline patterns whenever they need to. The district itself does so weekly. And the continuing issue, of course, is increasing staff data literacy. So that's a very brief overview, and I'm now going to hand over to Tim Moon to talk about what Syracuse continues to learn and engage in. Tim, to you and the poll.
Yes, the poll question. Were we going to put the poll back up? There we go. So do you think that this approach led to a significant decrease in the number of student suspensions? And do you think that this approach led to a significant decrease in the disproportionality of suspensions by race or disability classification? I see we've got some results rolling in here. 45 or 50 active folks, and I think overwhelming here for our first poll, close to 98%. And also for our second poll, we're coming in close to 70-30. All right. So as we continue to roll along here in Syracuse, one of the things we are taking a look at discipline as it rolls out during the school year so that we are avoiding sort of that autopsy of looking at data when it is too late to really do anything about it. The chart here shows suspensions per 100 students from the 2015 to the 2016 school year. We did break this out into really racial categories and then students, all students, and then students with disabilities. And you can see a significant drop. For example, our Black or African American students in the all student category went down from 74.4 down to 58.9. slightly less with the students with disabilities at 79.5 to 66.8. But we are seeing almost without question a drop in most categories from one year to the next as we move through. I should note that some of our multiracials did go up slightly as some of our smaller subgroups do have a smaller N size. So we're going to be curious to see this at the conclusion of our year to make sure that those are continuing in a downward trend. But some of what we're doing with our new discipline that was mentioned earlier, that we switched to a new discipline software, we are able to pull out and categorize those reports and make those available on a much more frequent basis than we were in the past. And we've been working with several offices internally to have those discussion groups at the building level. So our guidance counselors have been working with our students. We have those behavior intervention centers and been providing PD to those instructors as well to try and get a consistent, again, from school to school and room to room, consistent monitoring across the board. And that's one of our focus areas for the next year, is to really see what interventions and how effective those interventions are being within those behavior intervention centers from school to school, really trying to narrow down, are we seeing interventions that are working much better at the elementary versus the middle level, and then the middle level and the high school level. I think we've got overall our referral and suspension numbers going down. Disproportionality obviously isn't going away, but I am hopeful that we'll see those gaps closing up a little bit over time. But most of them did see somewhere between a 9.5 and an 8.5 point drop. And a fundamental change of the mindset and behavior takes a lot of time and effort, and it's been something that we've had to keep on the front burner, go back around to each of our buildings and work with our principals. It's part of our new teacher orientation. In fact, this year for the Syracuse City School District, our new teacher orientation is a full 10 days over the summertime. And then for second-year teachers, they come back and do an additional 5 days. And some of that time is spent on these classroom management techniques to make sure that we are remaining consistent across the board. So I think we have reached our question and answer period.
Thanks, Tim. This is Jessica Bailey from RELNI. And we do have a number of questions that we didn't get to last time from Dan's presentation, and we also have some questions that just arose during your presentation, Andrew and Tim. So keep them coming, please, and we have a lot of time here for questions. So let's start with some of the questions that just popped up, just so they're fresh in our mind. One of our guests asked, how did you define school-based arrest and or referrals? And did you follow up those cases through potential adjudication?
The U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights has definitions that are available online at ocrdata.ed.gov. And school-based, I don't have it. I'll probably misstate it if I say it, but basically, school-based arrests were for arrests for kids' behavior in school. So it wasn't like after school, that wasn't, unless it was a school activity. It wasn't like kids who were loitering after school or near the school, that kind of thing. And then referrals to law enforcement were when schools called law enforcement in to address a situation. And all all of these are required data elements with the U.S. Department of Education's Civil Rights Data Collection, or their survey, and every school and district will have to, again, answer those questions, and it's actually a form of noncompliance with Title VI not to answer that. So some districts will say, well, the police have those records, we don't have them. It's really an obligation now of the schools to work with the police to keep track of these data elements and then to report them to the federal government.
Great, thanks, Dan. There's a couple other questions for your presentation as well. Did you count depression as a disability?
So depression, if it rises to, and the student has been identified as having emotional distress, can be different things. Maybe they have another kind of disability, the autism and depression or that sort of thing. So depression alone is not one of the categories that the U.S. Department of Education would list, but if your depression is interfering with your ability to learn, then a student could be eligible for an IEP. These are individualized determinations, and these categories are not, hard and fast science. So it really requires a full evaluation with a psychologist, and they would say, and it involves talking with the parents and teachers and so forth. And so depression can absolutely rise to that level.
Great, thanks. Let's address some of the questions that were popping up during the Syracuse presentation. Rebecca asked, how did you change the role of school counselors? Are they responsible for standardized testing?
I don't think we really changed the role of the counselors. We did ask them to just take a different focus. Obviously, school counselors have always been a part of mediations and working with kids in general through their issues, but I think this was a concentrated focus on discipline and really trying to teach kids how to avoid certain behaviors or how to manage certain emotions in the heat of the moment. I would liken this to, we see a student, they get frustrated in class, then they curse the teacher, then they get thrown out, then they, punch a locker as they're going down the hallway, and then the next thing you know, they're running out of the building. And this entire escalation really stemmed from a particular issue in class if we come back to that root cause. And so if we can teach kids how to keep the little things little, like it starts out they're frustrated over something, and if they can learn how to handle that frustration, then we don't get into the other incidents, but it's also a skill that serves the student well beyond school. And I'm sorry, standardized testing, I'm sure it varies from building to building. There is a test coordinator in each building that heads up our testing, whether it be state testing or local benchmarks. In some cases, it's the counselor, but not always.
That's great, Ken. There's a few more questions that are coming in about what's going on in Syracuse. Terry McSweeney asked, did all staff receive training in restorative practices? If so, how did you fund the additional staff?
A little. Mainly that was offered. We have PD that is offered both after school. We have a professional development center. So it was offered at the professional development center. After school, we did a little bit in the buildings, like at faculty meetings and so on, and we did some through Saturday Academy. So we offered Saturday trainings that the teachers can come to. I'm not exactly sure on the funding sources. I'm sure some of it was through grants and so on, but I'm sure some of that was local as well.
Can I add to that initial training, the consultant who was hired to help with the whole process, facilitated, led the initial training. That was before you were there, Tim. But she was paid for that.
Great, and we have have a couple more questions about the staff in Syracuse. And Rebecca asked, did you add support staff, meaning therapists, counselors, aides? And also, did Althea asked, does Syracuse use school resource officers in their school building?
We do use school resource officers in our building. Every school has, I should say at least every secondary school has them. As far as trying to look at some of the other questions here. How is Syracuse responding staff who report that schools are more chaotic now and many students aggressive behaviors telling teachers? Okay. I haven't really, we've been, the superintendent and senior staff have been going around to the buildings listening to teachers, taking in notes, and this is really a staff listen, and it could be anything. It could be relative to the discipline policy or union issues or testing or the schedule or a number of things that the teachers bring up to us. And I have heard some of the pieces about the students. Generally, the code of conduct is broken down into 4 levels of general discipline, with suspensions occurring at the 3rd and 4th levels. It's not really the offenses at levels 3 and 4 that we're getting complaints on. It's not as if we're hearing that students should be suspended and aren't. It's more they're asking for more effective ways to deal with level 1 situations within the classroom.
Thank you, Tim. And Althea also asked, was training that you were discussing earlier mandatory or voluntary?
What occurred this year, and again, I came on board during the school year, the training that has occurred over the last year has been optional. And like we've done, God, I want to say it was pushing 500 teachers that have participated just this year alone in our professional development around the restorative practices.
Great, thanks.
And we have about 1,800 staff, to put it into perspective.
No easy feat. Rebecca and Questar had questions here about the coding system that you're using. And is Syracuse using a coding system that is different from the state coding system for reporting discipline incidents? And Questar the third asked, what software are you using to track student discipline data? Is it some other system than the student data management system?
It is. We're utilizing a software called Educator's Handbook, and that's what we're utilizing to track our student discipline. Most student management systems have obviously the capacity to track discipline. The thing that the tipping point, if you will, where most of those student information systems seem to fail is really tracking in PBIS what's known as minor behaviors. So finding a way to flag those behaviors that are really not worthy of an office referral, but enough that a teacher's going to want to know. I had a talk with Johnny today about calling out, and is this happening often enough that I need to reteach him that skill? And those are the sorts of things that it's tough for, you can submit a referral when there's, a food fight in the cafeteria, and that goes in a traditional student management system just fine. It's more the low-level stuff and tracking the frequency that's happening in a particular location or a particular time of day.
Thank you. And can you clarify whether the coding system that you're using is different from the state coding system for reporting discipline incidents?
At the end of the day, it's not, no. Most of the titles, we do put some of the terms a little bit closer to like code of conduct language or everyday language so that we can get accurate entry, but that stuff still maps out to the same fader codes that we use at the state level.
Great. And Wendy Horde, she had two questions. The first is, how is Syracuse responding to staff who report that their schools are more chaotic now and many students engaging in aggressive behaviors and are telling teachers that the staff can't do anything to them despite their behavior? So lack of any consequences because the restorative process is not implemented.
Like I said, I haven't really heard that. Again, it's not the egregious behaviors. It's not as if we're saying we cannot suspend students. Obviously, the chart that I had up showed that we do and continue to suspend students, but we do limit that to behaviors that are defined as levels 3 and 4. So what we're trying to do is take that that judgment out of saying, oh, it's little Johnny again, that frustration that that any adult feels sometimes when, you know, we've gone over this 3 times and you just, you know, it's not making sense to you. And try to take that emotion out of it and say, what is an appropriate consequence and what isn't, and in what cases. And that helps with the disproportionality, and that helps be for the district as a whole with 33 different buildings to be even and consistent from building to building, and from administrator to administrator and classroom to classroom.
This is great. So we had another question from Matten about what role does student voice play in formulating policies to reduce either the suspension rate or the disparity rate?
I'll jump in with the beginning with that, and I'd say that students were one of the groups involved in the 50 who designed this program. I'm not. Maybe you can say more about how they continue to be, but they were involved with this from the outset.
Tim, feel free to jump in if
Yeah,
you want to add anything to that.
Well, I think that's you know, I know our superintendent continues to meet, I believe every month with our student. She has a student cabinet, so she has probably 35 to 40 students that make up her student cabinet, and that's an opportunity for her to exchange with the students from each building and hear things from a student's perspective.
So if I could also add to that from sort of a 20,000 feet, restorative practices, most of the models, well, all the models, do involve very heavily students in addressing the sense of the classroom environment and school environment and responses to behavior when it escalates to the point that there's a decision that there's a restorative circle. So it involves students, it involves teachers, it involves whether the student or teacher was a victim of whatever the offense was, or it could have been a custodial person, or it could have been, you know, if it's addressing, well, it depends on, you know, what the issue is. And so the student voice is very, very important, and a lot of students become trained in running the circles and become sort of peer leaders in terms of addressing school climate. And so where it's been successful, you know, it's dramatically improved school climate and really student engagement in participating in having a very effective learning community.
Thank you for that, Dan. Michael Foley asked, are teachers in Syracuse prevented from referring students prior to checking with administrators? Because this could affect the numbers if this is occurring.
No, they're not. Teachers do have access to enter behaviors into the educator's handbook. Again, that's often encouraged to track behaviors within the classroom. Again, those quote-unquote minor behaviors. And so teachers need to have access to do that. If it's a referral that requires administrative action, they can then fill that out as well.
Thanks, Tim. Now, this may be a question that Dan might want to answer, or Tim, if you know, feel free to jump in. But someone had asked, could it be possible that African American students are now counted as multiracial now that the category is available, and hence African American went down and multiracial went up?
That's
So,
very-
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's very perceptive. I don't believe so because our overall numbers in each category have remained consistent. But feel free to jump in.
I was going to say it's unlikely where now the rule is that you self-identify, but it does. Some students may change how they self-identify as they get older, so it's possible. I've also heard stories of district personnel saying, well, I think this student is multiracial, can I switch their race? Asking, not me, but other attorneys whether this would be appropriate, and the answer would be no. But there's always the concern, I think, that as so we shine a light on things like discipline disparities, if there's some degree of accountability, that there's a pressure to just fix the numbers. But of course, that's not in the spirit of what we're doing, because the kinds of interventions that we're talking about that really work do make teachers feel safer, do make students feel safer, and are conducive to more effective learning environments. There's oftentimes this tension initially if teachers or principals, for that matter, are not buying into the change or just very hesitant because they may not feel that they have the training or the wherewithal to address behavior. So there's oftentimes sort of this, in the period of change, there can be a lot of tension and back and forth, but hopefully the resources and the supports for teachers and for students is put into place in a way that is positively reinforcing, and I don't mean that just for the students, but for the teachers as well.
Thanks, Dan. And Dan, going back to your slide 36, you had mentioned offenses, and Holly was wondering what types of offenses were considered as minor on that slide.
So, if that was a slide, was that from Syracuse? So, in Syracuse, there were the Vader categories had a whole set of very minor offenses and some others that weren't. But predominantly, they were things like disruption, tardiness, dress code violations, insubordination. I included, I believe, tobacco use, but by and large, they were one, and that was it's in the report. I just don't remember exactly what they were off the top of my head, but that was presented to the school board exactly what those differences. There were categories in between that weren't considered minor and weren't considered the most serious. So there would be, for example, you see violence with injury. Well, violence without injury was not considered minor, but it wasn't considered serious. So there were some in that middle category. There were some of the, sexual harassment would be serious, but if there was just bullying without the, I forgot exactly how it was parsed out, but it's clear in the report, and so you can find that, I believe, online.
I suggest
Great.
another way to go about that. This is Andrew here. Another way to go about that is actually you can go to the Syracuse City District website and download their sorry, I've lost the term for it, Tim, your code of conduct. So you could find that out for yourself.
Right, and you can see more recent data.
Yeah.
And if you disagreed with how I categorized it, you can create your own and see what it looked like. They're invariably, especially with things that might be on the border, some people say, well, that they may have disagreed, but it was pretty transparent.
Great. And so this may be a question that Tim Moon from Syracuse may want to answer, and others may want to jump in. But Wendy Horde said that sometimes staff feels that some aggressive behaviors like direct threats of physical harm are not minor offenses. They're not offenses that would lead to suspension, but the remarks from referring to Timothy Moon in Syracuse seems to minimize some of the experiences of staff who are victims of the aggressive behavior. Tim, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. I don't want to minimize any particular incident or offense. But the goal of a good code of conduct is to, when it's not the heat of the moment, when it's not emotional, to really lay out the behaviors and the appropriate consequences that would go along with that behavior. So when the district convened 50 people to sit down together and construct the code of conduct and go through the various behaviors, that committee made the recommendations that this window of discipline would be appropriate given that type of offense. Now, I don't believe that any code of conduct is quote-unquote written in stone, and as we go through this and we begin to collect more data and even more climate data, and it's not just, you know, the number of our suspensions are going down, but climate and a building kind of data. I believe that we can probably tease out if there's what would be an appropriate adjustment for some of the offenses or how they're ranked. None of that stuff is going to be perfect out of the starting gate, and but I also agree with Dan that, you know, the evidence is just overwhelming that the answer isn't simply suspending kids, whether it's in school or out of school.
Just to add to that, so the University of Chicago studied every school, the largest in the country, with lots of concerns about safety among teachers and students and parents. And so they looked at the schools serving the students from the highest crime neighborhoods. And what they found is that the ratings of safety in some of those schools were equivalent to schools serving kids from the richest neighborhoods, the wealthiest neighborhoods in Chicago. And so when they drilled down, what they found is that those schools that really had these higher safety ratings tended to invest in parent-teacher engagement and trust, and building trust between teachers and the students. So, and also very importantly, they had much lower than average suspensions. It's usually suspensions sort of add to disengagement, and it's not something that tends to build trust. So it's important to I think, monitor safety ratings and find this sort of win-win where you're investing the kinds of responses and interventions that are supporting teachers, but also parents and kids in ways that, you know, reduces suspensions, but it's not creating a safety problem. That no one is suggesting that we should put safety on the table. There's no that's really, I don't think anyone would say that would be acceptable.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Andrew and Tim. And we're moving to the end of the presentation now, and I want to remind everybody about an important survey that the U.S. Department of Education and REL Northeastern Islands, we really want to hear your feedback on this bridge event. So the link is there. Please just take a moment now to fill it out. It's always easier to do it now than to do it later while it's fresh in your mind. And I'm just going to turn it over to Peter Orn one last time to do the closing.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks to everyone on the call today. On behalf of REL Northeastern Islands, just want to let you know in 2 or 3 weeks you'll receive a thank you email from us with a link to the webinar archive and the downloads in the box below if you didn't get to those today. So have a great afternoon, and you can hang up or close out your, or have a great evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.